everyone. It's so wonderful to be here, and haven't the speakers so far been amazing? I think it really brings home the power of storytelling to describe what the SDGs are really all about. So I know I've had some light bulb moments already go off, so thank you for having me, and I'm really excited to share some of my story with you. So I'm going to start by asking a really bizarre question of you. What words do you think of when you see a fireworks display? Emissions, yes. Anything else?
Scared dogs.
Scared dogs, yes. Loud. Beautiful though, spectacular. Expensive. Short-lived, perhaps. A waste. Maybe nostalgic though, maybe brings back memories of childhood. But after a while, all kind of look exactly the same and certainly look better in real life than they do on an iPhone video. I wonder what would be the opposite of that image or that metaphor or that story. And we've already heard through Adam and some of the other speakers tonight just how powerful metaphors and stories are with driving change. And I think for me, something like the planting of a seed is a little bit of the opposite of the metaphor of a fireworks display. Something organic that grows down into the earth, that roots for long-term impact and change, but also grows up. That changes and evolves, that brings life, that's beautiful, that draws carbon. Yes, I wondered if anyone would say that, but is also unique to a certain place and a certain point in time. And I bet you're wondering what on earth this has to do with the Olympic and Paralympic Games, and I will get there. But really I want to touch on the power of metaphors and stories as vital elements to drive positive impact and change. We can set goals and targets, and they're all really important. But unless we're tapping into what makes people tick, that change is going to be harder for us to achieve. We've already heard from Ryan a little bit about sport and the power of sport as a convening platform to drive positive change and to engage people who potentially might not normally be as engaged on a certain issue. And that's fantastic. And I'd probably guess that most of us in the room would have a memory of an Olympic and Paralympic Games event. Maybe you can think of one as you're sitting here now. I remember I was 17 years old in the year 2000, and I was fortunate enough to be in the stadium in Sydney the night Cathy Freeman won gold. And clearly that achievement transcended sport. And there was this beautiful feeling of collective togetherness in that moment, and that was amazing. I remember being allowed in primary school to watch Kieran Perkins swim from lane 8 in the Atlanta Olympics, I think it was, and win. You know, we've all got those memories. And of course, we've all got those wonderful memories from the Paralympic Games as well, I'm sure. At the moment, we're seeing the Matildas play and do so well and garner that collective inspiration. But when we think about the sporting events themselves, the Olympic and Paralympic Games themselves as events, I wonder which of the metaphors that I spoke about just before are historically emblematic of how those events are run. And I'd say it's more the fireworks display. Cities, regions have had to mould and change themselves to meet the requirements of delivering Olympics, which after a while kind of look a little bit replicable. They're expensive and they're amazing in the moment, but are the benefits short-lived, or are there legacy benefits pre and post those events? And in 2018, the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, as a lot of sporting federations and organisations have done, recognised the need for them to play a role in driving global change, particularly as it relates to sustainability and climate action. And they introduced what's called the New Norm Agenda. Has anyone heard of this? Yeah, a couple of people. Essentially, it's about 118 reforms that are designed to change the way these mega events are run. Because let's be honest, they have traditionally been conduits for waste, for extensive use of energy, and often not all regions that host these games have experienced long-term legacy benefits. So the intent of these reforms is basically to do what it says on the screen there, to cut cost, complexity, risk and waste. But you can only do that by delivering these things in partnership. And I think that's critical, like with many things to do with sustainability and the just transition to a renewable economy that's economically fair for all. That can't be done by government alone, and it can't be done by the private sector or any other sector alone. It needs to be underpinned by partnerships with researchers, the private sector, government of all layers. And that is how we can deliver things like the Olympic and Paralympic Games in a way that genuinely drives legacy benefits. I won't harp on these too much, but these are the sustainability priority areas or themes of the IOC. And you might see quite obviously, they align with the SDGs really nicely. And they cover not just climate, but of course other areas of sustainability, workforce, infrastructure and natural sites, mobility, which isn't just about sustainable or renewable transport, but also accessible transport for all, and sourcing and resource management, driving supply chain transformation to a genuinely circular economy. And you may have heard something about a climate positive Brisbane 2032 Olympics, and the most common question I get asked is, well, what does climate positive mean? What's the definition of it? And quite frankly, it's just the way in which the IOC has termed what they believe as a genuinely low impact and hopefully neutral impact event. The first two pillars of this are of no kind of surprise to anyone working in this space. They're about reducing emissions as much as possible in line with Paris and then offsetting more than the residual emissions that are left. It's the third bit that's the cool bit, I think, because that's not just about the events themselves. That's about how do we harness the convening power, the catalyst, the interest that we get through sport to drive change now and into the future. It's about using sport, and in this case the Olympic and Paralympic Games, as a catalyst to deliver long-lasting climate benefits and economic benefits and sustainability benefits for Queensland and Australia. It's a big ask, and it is also really broad and nebulous. And I think as a collective, particularly as a group of Queenslanders, we actually need to work out what that means for us. So I'm going to take a little bit of a detour from the Olympic and Paralympic Games for a moment here. Who sometimes, often, gets a little bit disenfranchised and overwhelmed with the scale of climate and biodiversity challenges that we're facing? And I think, yeah, I mean, most of us, and I think that's why we're in this space, why we're interested, is we know that the challenges are huge and we're trying to do our part to make an impact. And it's really easy to lose hope, I think. Less so now. I think that, you know, we're seeing change over the last few years. But hope is so important, and a collective hope is really important for us to not get paralysed by inaction when we're faced with these giant global challenges, but to be galvanised individually and collectively to make change. And I love this quote. It's from one of my favourite books by one of my favourite authors. And it's really about that we don't need to know the answer to have hope. We actually need to be open to the uncertainty, to many different possibilities for the future, and we need to embrace that. And a few years ago, I decided I wasn't busy enough and working full-time in Sydney, and I just got married and found out that we were going to have a baby, and I thought, you know, I need something else on top of that, and I decided to do a PhD. And, and then COVID hit, so that was really great timing on my behalf. But for me, I was really interested in, this is all great, we can have all the aspirations in the world, but what are some of the models and ways of thinking that we can use to actually engage people to drive change, but not in a way that's generic and imposed, in a way that's unique to certain places? Because as has been touched on a bit tonight, each place has its own story, and in Australia, and the land we now call Australia, we are so fortunate that those stories go back for millennia, and that the richness of that is amazing. So for me, I started a PhD in futures thinking about the future in different ways, and regenerative practice, looking at how do we not just do no further harm environmentally, socially, economically, but actually regenerate the harm, the debt we've already accrued. There's nothing worse than when people go on and on about their PhDs. I know sometimes, you know, you ask someone what their PhD's in and they give you like a 2-hour lecture, and so I promise I won't talk about it any further. But one of the things that for me really landed through that process was this idea of regeneration. And this idea that, you know, we have already accrued debt as a global community. How do we work to identify ways in which we can pay that back? How do we operate? And I've forgotten the word, I'm sorry, Adam, but Adam spoke about a term earlier around, to me, essentially, our breath, we breathe out, it goes to everyone and then it comes back in. And it just reminded me of this idea of being within nature and embedded as part of nature, not separate from. And I hope that I've understood that correctly. But I just really resonated with that idea that, you know, our actions, but even the way we think about the world around us, are so critical for driving change. So anyway, this idea of regeneration is, you know, thinking about where can we find ways that we can actually work as part of the natural systems that we're really reliant on. Now, one of the favourite little methods that I love to use is this particular method called causal layered analysis, and don't get put off by the name because the name is horrendous. But really it's about how do we look below the surface? How do we think about how what is potentially unseen drives change? And again, Adam, another shout out, you talked about a metaphor driving and impacting how you think about strategy and then changing the systems you have and what you do. And you've stolen my thunder because that's exactly what I'm going to talk about now. So this is a model by a famous futurist called Suhail Inayatullah, who's a dear friend of mine. And it basically helps us to think about an issue, an event, ourselves, anything, in a way that's more layered. So it starts with what we can see, what's observable. For the Olympic and Paralympic Games, maybe that's, you know, carbon neutral emissions. Maybe that's zero waste to landfill. Maybe that's full stadiums and Australia winning so many medals. It also then asks us to think about the systems that support that. What are the systems that need to be in place, and are the systems we have currently conducive to driving those outcomes? Or do we need to work differently? And that's not, again, unique to these sporting events. That's full stop to achieve sustainability goals. What are the attitudes or the worldviews that we need to garner and support to deliver on those things? And finally, what's the metaphor or the foundational story that supports that? We can aim for the top, what's above the surface, as much as we like, but if we're not tapping into the things that lie beneath that and that really drive those things, I'd argue we're not going to reach those long-lasting changes that we would like to reach. And I think when we think about working with communities, working on mega events, but also just driving change more broadly, it's really on us to open our minds and to think a bit differently. And I think the SDGs provide us with a framework, if you like, to do that. But again, it's not just about ticking the boxes, we all know. It's about being flexible with how we think about the world, how we think about what's possible, but most importantly, how we think about what we're doing here relating to what's around us. Again, a rather obtuse image that I'm putting up here, but obviously this is a spider's web. And I really love this as a reminder of working in a way that's connected, because a spider's web starts from a central point. For Brisbane 2032, for Brisbane more broadly, it starts from this idea, what does it mean for Brisbane, as we call it now? You know, what is the story of this place? And who do we need to listen to know what that actually is? Because we need to listen to many people, and we need to listen to the people who own these lands, of course. What are the points of connection that Brisbane has? And when we're planning an event like the Olympic and Paralympic Games, how does what we do for that event or that piece of infrastructure affect things more broadly? And clearly, that's challenging, and it's not perfect. And you know, we could argue that mistakes are always going to be made in the planning, but how can we reflect on those? The thing I love about a spider's web, it reminds me almost of what Mick is trying to do with 17X as well. It's creating these points of connection between people, but between systems, and through that getting bigger and stronger as a collective, but still focused on a common goal. The other thing that I like about this, without getting too philosophical, is there's gaps in a spider's web. You don't need to touch or do something to everything. And I think we can all remember that when we're planning things like the Olympic and Paralympic Games. What do we need to take our hands off of? So, back briefly to the Olympic and Paralympic Games and to regenerative work or driving sustainability change more broadly. It's not enough for us to think, of course, about the policy frameworks that we have, although those are important. We also need to think about the cultural tools we can use to engage people. We need to identify different ways to evaluate things. If we evaluate projects, outcomes in the same way we've always done, we're not going to drive that innovation or change that we need to. And that goes for how government, for example, procures things as well. Considering things from their whole of life perspective is a bit of a paradigm shift. How do we engage meaningfully and not just one-off? How do we move beyond consultation? And finally, and critically, I think, especially when we're looking at things like venues and villages for the Olympic and Paralympic Games, it's not enough for a particular building to be sustainable if it's having negative implications on the community or the systems in which it sits. I'm running out of time and I'm going to take the hint, so I won't labour the point on this slide, but essentially for me, as I was reflecting for this evening and for this discussion, just a reminder, I think, that understanding the underlying metaphors and worldviews that drive us all and examining whether they're actually conducive to the outcomes we want to achieve is really fundamental. And I think as change makers, how do we help others to do the same? And I'll leave you with one final question. What would your metaphor or story of a genuinely sustainable legacy for Brisbane in 2032 and beyond be? Thank you.